So today we're going to be building upon last month's webinar, which was all about creating part animations in order to bring your renderings to life. You know, it's a good way to increase engagement and create a much more powerful presentation when you have animations to go along with your renderings. But creating part animations is really only half of the picture. In KeyShot, we can animate more than just our parts. We also have camera animations, which can add a lot of dynamics to your visuals as well, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And for you, those of you who have already attended the last few webinars, this slide might look familiar, but for anyone who's new, there's a few items we'd like to cover before we jump in. First and foremost, this presentation and webinar is going to be recorded, and it will be made available on youtube.com/KeyShot3D when we're done. And then the slideshow that we're using as part of the presentation, as well as the KeyShot package file that we'll use for an example, will also be made available, and you will be able to download those in the description of the YouTube video when it goes live. Additionally, if you're curious about our hardware, we are using a 3 GHz 8-core 2013 Mac Pro. It's got 16 gigabytes of RAM. And if you have questions about the webinar or anything else during the presentation, feel free to type those in the GoToMeeting control panel, and either Josh, Rex, or Richard should be able to answer those questions, no problem. We will also have some time for a Q&A at the end of this presentation as well, so sit tight if you want to ask a more involved question. And last but not least, KeyShot Animation is a pro feature, so for those of you using KeyShot HD, you might have the opportunity to see some of the value added when you upgrade to Pro. And for those who have KeyShot Animation already, then you'll be able to use all these features we covered today. And last but not least, I have to apologize for having a bit of a cold. Been under the weather lately. Hopefully that's not too distracting, but thank you guys. And before we actually begin talking about how to animate our cameras, there's some topics that we're going to cover. Here's the outline of today's presentation. We'll begin with some nice examples, and we'll look at why those examples are strong or good demonstrations of camera animations. And then we'll get into the overarching principles of KeyShot camera animations, kind of like we did on the previous webinar as well. Now, before we talk about the actual how-tos of animating a camera, it would only make sense that you guys understand all of the parameters and settings that we can control within our cameras in KeyShot. So we'll definitely break those down as well. Then we'll take a look at some animation types that you can apply to your cameras. And then when we go into our hands-on portion, we'll basically follow up with a demo of a lot of these topics that we will talk about during this slideshow. So you guys will see both kind of the methodology behind it as well as how to implement it in KeyShot as well. So without further ado, we are going to get into some of our examples. This first example I'd like to show you is a great example of depth of field being animated. And then the camera itself moves around, and what's cool is it ends on a view or an angle that shows the logo that Zenith Systems was using. So again, in this example, you can see how it looks abstract in the beginning, but then when viewed from the proper angle at the end, there's a bit of a reveal, kind of a nice little surprise, which is a fun thing that you can do with your visuals as well when you bring animation into the picture. So next we have a different type of an animation where we've got lots of recognizable elements. We've got our ground and our lights and our car. And as the camera moves around here, a couple nice things happen. We get to see more angles of our car, of course, but we also get to see the surfacing of this product, this car. And you see the lights, the strips of lights as they're reflected kind of dance across the surface of the car, which really helps describe that. So for anyone who's got a product that they are trying to really convey or explain, this is a nice way to do that, a nice subtle way. And you can also tell if you look on the floor, the varying roughness of those tiles also kind of allow them to glisten as the camera moves around. It's just lots of nice details you can get out of a camera animation. In this next example, the last example we have, is a little bit more like a commercial, so to speak, kind of like a product animation. Now, of course, the camera's the only thing being animated in all of these, but there's a lot of different ways you can do it. And in this last one, it's kind of supposed to play between some faster and slower cuts to kind of bring some energy and dynamics into the animation as well. It's supposed to kind of get you excited for this product if you were going to buy it or use it perhaps. So now that we've looked at some of those examples and we can kind of understand where we might take our animations when we get to animate cameras, we need to know how to get into the animation workspace. And the animation button at the bottom of the toolbar in your KeyShot workspace is going to launch the animation workspace. You can also hit the A key on your keyboard as a shortcut to bring it up. And once you've done so, the animation workspace will look like this. On the right-hand side, you've got your animation properties. So let's say we select an animation we've previously made. In the properties there on the right-hand side, you can go ahead and make changes to those, and then they'll update in real time. Also, we have our timeline, which runs across the top. It's our chronological left to right. That's how we know where we are in a given animation. Next, on the left, we also have our toolbar. That's going to include things like the animation wizard and the space where we can change our frame rate and play, pause, or add motion blur, or get a preview of our animation as well, if that's what we want to do. So there's a lot of cool things we can use there. And then last but not least, we have our animation list on the left-hand side, and that's where we're going to get our that's where we're going to see our animations stack up as we create them. So some principles that are going to apply to camera animations as a whole, I want to make sure we iterate. KeyShot has 3 different types of animations. We have part animations, camera animations, and material animations. And of course, today we will be talking about the camera animations. So cameras have a number of properties, 3 major areas that we'll look at today. And these are all this is how the camera tab is broken into 3 discrete areas. First, we have position and orientation. Then we have our lens settings and our lens effects. So once we understand each of these and how to change those and what those do to our cameras in KeyShot, we will have a good idea of how to then animate those properties, and it should make the animation tools much easier to use. So looking at the first set of options, we have, again, you can reference on the right-hand side here, you can reference the camera tab, and when you open the first collapsible accordion, we have a position and orientation. So position is going to be the distance from the camera to the look at point. And the look at point is wherever your camera is basically pointed. And you actually need to select a look at point if you would like the camera to look at a specific area on your model. And once you have done so, all of the animations or the adjustments you make to that camera will be in relation to or affected by that look at point. So that distance slider you see is going to be changing the distance your camera is from that look at point, and the azimuth is going to allow you to adjust the direction your camera is, the angle your camera is pointing left to right. Inclination is going to be adjusting how your camera is pointed, how much up or down, and then twist is also going to allow you to rotate the camera around its central axis as well. And as you adjust those, you're basically going to see those update the real-time view, because your real-time view is always looking at your scene through the active camera. And then as mentioned, that look at point, of course, you can select the button or click the button that says look at point to then click on the part of your model that you want the camera to be facing. We can also select a look at point or look at more than one object by choosing from the scene tree and then right clicking, and your camera will by default look at the center of that selection, whether it's a model or just an individual part or a number of parts. So it's good to be aware of what your look at point is, because as you animate or adjust your camera, it will update or do so based upon that look at point. The next set of settings we have are lens settings. And this is going to cover a few items. So perspective and focal length is the first parameter. That's our first slider that we can change. And this is going to adjust the amount of vertical convergence. That's another kind of word for perspective. And for anyone who's not real familiar with either of those terms, think of you standing at the base of a really tall building and looking up at it. You're going to see the edges of that building look like they eventually meet each other as you go toward the top floor, as you go further away. Same as if you're standing, say, in the middle of a road on a desert, just a straight road. It's going to look like it converges off in the distance, and that's an effect of perspective. So when you go ahead and drag that slider, you're going to notice that the field of view slider changes as well. And this is because your focal length and your field of view and your perspective, they're all tied together. They're all related. So they're not settings that you adjust completely independently. With your perspective / focal length, that kind of under the hood is adjusting the distance between your camera's lens and the sensor. But what that does, again, is it affects your field of view. So how much of your scene is actually visible through the frame. So how much of your scene are you seeing, basically. And again, once you are aware of kind of how these work, that's going to make it far easier when you start to animate these settings. And lastly, we have our lens effects, and this is going to cover just depth of field. But again, it's a pretty important item to understand how it works in order to then use it effectively through animation. So when you enable depth of field by clicking the checkbox, as you can see on the right-hand side, and then you establish your point of focus. So you click the select point of focus button, and then you can click on your model, the area that you wish to be sharp and clear and in focus. And then in KeyShot, the f-stop slider is how we're going to adjust the strength of our blur. So what it's really doing is it's adjusting the size of the depth of field. And as we increase that number, we're going to see that more of our scene is less blurred. And as we decrease that number, it's going to be more of an extreme blur. So hopefully I said that right. So the smaller the number your f-stop, the more extreme or the strong the blur will be. The higher the number, the less that blur will be. And so between your position and orientation, your lens settings, and your lens effects, if you understand how each of those work and affect your real-time view, then you should have a good foundation to build upon for animating all of these settings. And of course, our cameras behave similar to our pieces of geometry in that they can be animated. So they're just objects that you apply animations to. And view sets, for those of you who like to use those actually work as well. That basically allows you to change the lighting settings from camera to camera as well. So the next principle is that our animations, or an entire sequence of animations, is created from a series of individual transforms. And these are they're represented by these boxes or these rectangles that show up in our animation timeline. And we can click and drag those around. We can make them happen simultaneously by making sure they start at the same time. We can do things like group them or mirror them. Just like you can animate the objects in your scene, you can interact with those animations for cameras in the exact same manner. One thing before I go forward, I should mention those animations that you apply to cameras, they are unique to cameras, which means if I create a zoom animation on camera 1 and then I go to camera 2, we're not going to see that zoom animation in our timeline because it will only show the animations for that active camera. And again, I'll demonstrate and show that in the hands-on portion as well. Our third principle is actually the geometry view. And for those of you who have never used the geometry view, that's going to be nice for a few reasons. One, it's going to smooth your playback, meaning we can get basically much faster playback in the geometry view because it's an open GL viewer. It's a more simplified visual representation of our scene. And because KeyShot's not trying to render out realistic materials in the geometry view, it plays the action much more smoothly, which is nice. And I find this particularly helpful when creating animations in the very beginning, where I'm not super concerned about where reflections and highlights fall, but I'm just mostly concerned about building the tempo or the pacing or getting those precise camera movements. The other thing that's nice with the geometry view is you can go ahead and see actually cameras and their paths. They actually show up in the geometry view, so those are visualized. And again, I'll make sure that we cover this and demonstrate this in the hands-on portion so you can see, but I just want to throw that one out there that it's a nice little tool. And you can access it through the window drop-down menu or hitting O on your keyboard, short for OpenGL. A few more things before we go past the geometry view is that there's a few main settings that you should be aware of. So those icons across the top allow you to change how you use the geometry view. We have settings which allow you to hide or show particular elements of your scene. Our display style will control whether something is shaded or it's just a wireframe representation. And depending on your hardware setup and the complexity of your scene, sometimes you want to change the display style to get a greater degree of performance. Again, just faster playback, more natural as well. Our active camera drop-down menu allows us to change which camera we're viewing our scene through. And this could be the active camera, in which case the little red dot, that's our camera here. We would be looking through that just as if we were back in our real-time view. But then if we go to a perspective view, that's what allows us to kind of leave those cameras and look at our scene through kind of a free camera, so to speak. And we can move around that way. So that's really nice. And last but not least, we also have our standard views, which we can change, top, left, right, bottom, that type of thing. In the icon to the right of the active camera dropdown. So we'll show you this, but I want to make sure you guys know how to access those and that some of those options do exist. And at this point, we're going to take a look at our camera animation types. So all the different types of animations we can apply to our cameras. And you can see the list is pretty long at this point. There's quite a few that we can take advantage of. I've drawn a box around the ones that we're going to look at, and they're separate from the model or part animations, which are on top. So first and foremost, we're going to look at orbit, and this is where the camera is going to rotate around that active camera's look at point. So we mentioned a look at point earlier. Just keep in mind that that's going to be the center of this rotation, more or less, and we'll demonstrate how that affects an orbit in our hands-on portion. Also, the degrees, that's the number of degrees that we're going to move around. So 360 in this case would be a full circle. And we could, of course, change the direction of that orbit by using a negative value instead of a positive value of 360 degrees. So in this chair here, we can see the camera does an orbit around the chair, and we know that because the sticker on the ground is moving, or it appears to be moving as well. And obviously the camera was looking at the center of that chair because the chair itself stayed right in the middle of the frame. So next we have zoom. And the zoom is where we're going to basically make the field of view larger or smaller. So the camera's not moving, but we're going to change the size of the field of view to make your object look either larger or smaller. It's just like how zoom works on a real camera. We basically have the option to establish a from and a to focal length, and that's going to be our starting and ending point. Now think the smaller the number you put in here, the wider our field of view is going to be, and a larger number, the smaller the field is going to be. So the smaller number is going to essentially zoom out further from our settings, or our scene, sorry. So in this example here, if we go ahead and zoom, we're not zooming out, but we're zooming in, and then we zoom back out there. So again, that's where the camera stays put. Inclination is where the camera is going to do a vertical tilt around the camera's look at point. And same goes for the degrees. That's how much it's going to move. And of course, you can always use a negative value if needed. And here's an example of how this looks. So we incline up to look down on the chair and back to where we started. Next we have translation, and translation is going to basically move our camera in a linear path from one location to another. And we can establish where it's going to move to by inputting the values for X, Y, and Z. So it will move however many units are, or whatever our scene is modeled in. If we're talking millimeters, like if our object is modeled in millimeters, that we imported into KeyShot, then these values are going to be millimeters here, the X, Y, and Z values. So keep in mind, like I tend to model in millimeters or something smaller like centimeters. And then if you're in a KeyShot scene and your object's fairly large, or you want to move your camera a fair distance, these numbers and these values are going to have to be pretty large. You may not see much of a result in the default value of 1. So just keep that in mind. Also, the axis orientation, we allow you to change it to local. And this can be helpful if you've already animated or moved the camera and you want to then do a translate from that camera's position and those X, Y, Z coordinates in relation to the camera's local origin. So in this example here, we're just going to move our camera. It's going to move down, then back up and back down. So for panorama, this is where we're going to pivot around the camera's center from side to side. Think almost like you're looking left and looking right without moving your shoulders. That's essentially what this will do. And same goes as before with the degrees. And we'll look at this example here. This one's a little less noticeable. It looks kind of like the chair's just moving left to right, but in fact, the camera's swiveling around its center point. Next, we have dolly. And dolly, I just want to draw a little attention to because it's oftenly used interchangeably with zoom. And in fact, they're not really at all the same thing. So I just want to be clear that the dolly is when you're actually moving your camera closer or further from the subject. And this, you just type in the distance you want to move it, and the camera will move that distance from its current position. So if, again, we're in millimeters, you may want this, to move 500 millimeters or so to be, I don't know, I think like about 1.5 feet or so. And in this example here, we dolly the camera further away and then back to it. So it's almost as if the camera's like on wheels, you're moving it back and forth. And depth of field. So this is where this is used in films all the time to direct our viewers' eyes. So if you want to bring attention to a particular item, this is very, very useful. And what you do is you have a number of sliders and some buttons. It looks more complicated than it is. All you're going to do is select a starting point of focus, which you can do with the first button. Click on the area you want to be in focus, and the from focus distance will then update accordingly. So you don't actually have to type in a value there unless you have numbers that you know you're going to want to input, which pretty much never happens. You usually just click on the point of focus. And then your to focus distance is going to be the area that's going to be sharply in focus at the end of that animation. So if it's a 1 second animation, you're going to have a focus distance at 0 seconds and at 1 second. And then the from f-stop, just to remind you, and the to f-stop, that's just going to control the amount of blur, like the strength of that blur. So the smaller the number, the more intense that is. The higher the number, the more the subtle that effect will be. And here's our example. So you see, before I start this animation, the bottom left side of the frame is in focus on the tip of that chair's wooden track. And then when we focus to the back and then focus back up to the front. And that's just what that looks like. Now, I do want to mention that depth of field does take a fair amount of time to render. So if that is something you want to take advantage of, by all means you should, but you can expect longer render times with that feature, just as if you were rendering a still image as well. And a camera switch event is how we move from one camera to the other. And why would we want to do this? Well, think about this. We have one camera. Let's say we apply a few animations to it, but then we want to jump to a camera that's doing a totally different set of movements. Well, if we wanted to do that, of course, we need more than one camera to begin with, and then we need to use a camera switch event to switch from one to the next. And this is a nice way to build up an entire animation in one KeyShot scene. So with this, you basically have more than one camera, and it will start with, I like to make sure I'm on the active camera first, and then I create my camera switch event. And then you just use the drop-down box to choose your to camera, and that's what you're going to be jumping to. So it's very, very simple. In this example, we're going to show a camera switch event where camera 1's doing a bit of an orbit, and then we switch to camera 2, which is doing a dolly out. So you can see how you can jump from one animation to the next, as if it was cut just like in a TV show or a movie. And now time settings. This is at the end because, of course, all of our animations have the same time settings parameter. And this is where you can choose how fast or how slow your animation plays. It also allows you to ease in and ease out using our motion easing drop-down box. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But know that basically here you have a start, an end, and a duration. And I use these all the time to make sure an animation is starting at the same point I want, or at the right point in time that I want it to. And I use that duration box a lot to control how long I want the animation to last in the timeline. So on the left here, you see an example of linear motion. It looks very unnatural, and the chair is kind of just rocking back and forth. No deceleration or acceleration. Whereas on the right, we see an ease in and ease out effect where there's both acceleration and deceleration throughout the chair's movement. The other thing that we can add to help increase believability is motion blur. And in this example, this is motion blur applied to an animated object. So we already saw this last week. On the left-hand side, you can see how choppy that movement looks frame to frame. But on the right, we've got the motion blur enabled, and you can see how it kind of blurs frame to frame, and it kind of leaves that ghosting effect. And in my opinion, that helps to add quite a bit of realism and offer smoother playback that's a lot nicer to look at as a viewer. Now, of course, we're talking about cameras this week, so we have motion blur that we can apply to camera movements as well, which is really great. Think about, in this example, we have an object like this chair that has no motion blur applied to it. The chair itself is not moving whatsoever. But the camera I've animated is moving left to right, and by being able to apply motion blur to that camera, we also get a nice smooth playback. In this case, we do not have any motion blur applied to the moving camera. So you can see it's a little bit jarring, and if I were to pause this anywhere, that chair would be in perfect, crisp focus. You would not see any blurring going on, which is not terribly natural. In this case, we have the same animation, but we have applied motion blur to that camera. So if I were to pause this, of course, you'd see that ghosted trail effect where the chair itself looks like it's being blurred, but it's just the camera that we've applied the motion blur to. So I just want to throw those out there as ways that you can improve and improve the believability of your renderings and your animations. And I want to summarize here with a little bit of best practices, and then we will jump right into our hands-on portion, where we will demonstrate a lot of these topics we've covered. So first is storyboard, and I like to plan out my animations first. This means horrible little thumbnail sketches on a piece of paper that tell me kind of what I want to see frame to frame. And by building that out first, I'm able to come up with something that I think looks cool, that I can imagine, and then find out how to make it happen in KeyShot. I don't start using KeyShot's palette of animation tools and then come up with how I want to do my animation. So I find that works the best. Starting with a fresh scene will ensure a smooth experience, meaning I like to start with a fresh scene that doesn't have any animations added to it yet, rather than deleting a bunch and then adding new ones. I like to just start fresh. And another little tip that I found along the way, it's more of a workflow thing, but if you save your scene in stages, it gives you kind of an out or a back door if you ever work yourself into a corner and then you want to undo some stuff that you can't. I like to save my scene in intervals. So once I get all the materials on my geometry and all my lighting set up, I might save that as one, and then once I've applied my first set of animations, for my first sequence, I might save that as 2, and so on and so forth. So I can always go back to a previous version if needed. Next, create cameras or view sets before animating them. I like that the animation wizard will allow you to create a new camera if you want to add one and then animate it. But I like to, again, because I'm planning everything out ahead of time, I like to have those added to my list of cameras before I actually animate them. Next is being aware of adjusting cameras after they've been animated. So of course, our real-time view is always going to reflect where we are in our animation. So if we're 5 seconds into an animation, our camera's position is likely to be different than where it started. So if I go ahead and change the position or some of the parameters of our active camera midway through an animation, we might not have the whole scene framed up the way we want in the other frames. And I'll show you what that looks like in our hands-on portion as well. Next is camera switch events with depth of field can cause real-time view to struggle. So it just can be easier to get smoother playback if you are not trying to use both of those at the same time. Just something to be aware of in the real-time view. Next is don't make your animations too slow. And that sounds a little bit funny and perhaps judgmental, but nothing is worse than trying to share an animation you're really excited with, but then losing your audience because it's just moving way too slow. I've seen 3, 4, 5-minute animations that are just, they could be condensed into 30 seconds. And given with how quick our TV and movies are cut these days, we are used to interpreting really fast moving imagery. So I would say try to err on the side of a little faster than too slow. Just an opinion though. And last but not least, motion easing and motion blur make animations look more natural and real. And that's just what I wanted to, that's what we demonstrated in the previous slides where we saw the chair with both motion blur and some motion easing. That really just, it helps create animations that look a lot more realistic. So that's our best practices. And at this point, we're going to jump into our hands-on portion. All right, I have a scene here that I have prepared ahead of time just to show you, mostly I wanted to share with you how I've organized our animation timeline and what is inside this animation. And then I'm going to open up a different scene and we'll actually start creating some animations inside there. So the drone that you saw as the example earlier in the slideshow, where the camera moved past the drone a few times, and then the drone itself, or the camera did an orbit around the drone, it went fast to slow to fast again, and then we kind of got this aerial bird's eye pullback. That was done with this KeyShot scene. And as you notice in the beginning, I had a different environment at first, and then I switched to one where the lighting was a little different and we didn't have our HDRI visible. And that was done by using view sets. However, in the end, I decided I didn't really like those first few frames or sequences where it was in the warehouse. So ultimately, I cut that out and I just rendered out the last portion of this animation. I just thought it looked a little too odd having it in 2 locations. But this was good to see as an exercise to know that it does work. So what you're looking at here on the timeline, each of these orange dots is a representation of a camera switch event. So every time you see an orange dot, we're going to be switching to a different camera. So if I look at my camera list, we have a number of cameras that are mostly view sets actually. They are named and they're in order, and they say things like depth of field or not depth of field. And that's just another thing you can do to give yourself notes as to what each camera looks like. The other thing is on the left-hand side, you can see that we've got folders labeled sequence 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what I've done here is I've basically grouped certain animations or transforms, individual transforms, into sequences. And this is how I kind of think of my animation as like scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. Well, you break a scene down into different sequences. And so this is how I went about creating all of those. And you can see each item is named well. And that's again, to aid in the organization of this entire animation. So you can go ahead and build as many as you need and then make sure that you organize them, and it's nice and easy to work with. Okay. So now that we've gotten a chance to take a look at that, we're going to actually walk through creating some animations in a different file. All right, and at this point, what I'm doing is just opening up the same model, but we don't have any animations applied here at all yet. We don't have any cameras, just a free camera. So this is basically a fresh scene that we're starting with. So one thing I'll do first and foremost, before getting into this too much, is grab my image and go ahead and set my resolution to something lower. This is going to help with playback, as well as allow me to maximize my timeline down here to have more space to work with. So of course, now all of a sudden it's not sticking. The reason that is because I did not lock my resolution. So I'll go ahead and set my resolution and I'll hit lock resolution. And now at this point, I should be able to adjust my timeline as needed. Perfect. So here we are. We can move our camera freely. We have just a free camera. Let's say first and foremost, what we want to do is add a camera and then animate it. So in this case, I'm going to add a camera with the add camera button. We are going to go to our animation wizard, which is on the top left-hand corner of our animation workspace. And let's say I want to start off with something like an orbit. I'll hit next. I'll choose camera 1 and I'll hit next. So 360 degrees is a full circle. We're going to stick with that. We'll use a linear motion easing. And for me, 5 seconds is a little too long. I'm going to go down to 3 seconds for a full circle, and then I'll hit finish. And we can go ahead and play that back, and you'll notice it plays fine, but we got a lot of noise. This is when I would suggest going into something like our geometry view, which I'll hit O on the keyboard to bring up. And our geometry view is a nice little workspace that, again, is our OpenGL shaded view space. And there's a few things that we can do here. So that gear I mentioned, we can click on this and I can say change my background color to something a little different. I have a ground grid I can toggle on and off, but since I have an actual ground plane in my scene, I don't feel the need to have the ground grid on. We see these two lights. These are IES profiles, so I'm going to turn those lights off. We don't need to see those. And I'll keep everything else visible at this point. So we have our camera path, pivot, field of view, and our active cameras as well. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. And at this point, if I go ahead and play my animation, we're going to see exactly what's happening with our camera. And by default, it's looking at the center of our model, which is great because that allows us to keep our model in the middle of our frame as the camera swings around it. But what would happen if I changed my look at point, just out of curiosity? So if I click on, say, the propeller here, and I right click and I do look at, now all of a sudden, if I bring up that geometry view and I go ahead and play back, oops, of course it didn't save because I didn't save my camera. Let's go ahead and do that real quick. So we'll do a look at, and I will see the unsaved. I have to make sure I save that first. Now, if I open up my OpenGL viewer, we should be able to see now that as we play back this orbit, it's doing an orbit, but it's now looking at the propeller of the drone, not the center of it. And of course, in our real-time view, if we were to play that back, what you're going to notice is it looks like it's super off-center, and that's just because we're now pivoting around a different look at point. So I just really want to hammer in that look at point. If your animation's not behaving the way you expected it to, then it's probably because your look at point needs to be adjusted. So another thing, let's say we wanted to do a dolly out while our camera's orbiting. We can go ahead and create another animation, choose the exact same camera to animate, and notice it went back to the first frame of the animation. When I click that camera, I'll hit next. And now my distance, I know this scene's in millimeters, so I'm going to have to type in a bigger value than 1. I'll start with 500. I'll hit enter. And the duration is too long. Let's make this 3 seconds as well. Now what I really like about this is I can go ahead and scrub along the timeline to see the effect that's going to have. Now of course it's hard to tell with that first animation, so I'm going to disable it with a little checkbox, and now I see the effect of only that dolly. And it's not quite as extreme as I want, so I'll try 2000. And now we see how far we move, and that looks pretty good to me. And I can take that linear easing and I can do an ease in, ease out. Go ahead and try that, and I'll hit finish. And I can turn this other animation back on. And if I open my geometry view, what we'll see is we've created a spiral effect where our camera's starting closer and then it's going to move further away. And if we want to see this through the point of view of the active camera, I can change that in my real-time or in my geometry view, and I can play this back and we can see the effects we're getting. So that's good and well, but let's say we wanted to have a totally different camera with different animations applied to it. Well, in that case, I'd go ahead and lock my first camera since I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to add a second camera. I'll just leave it called camera 2. And you notice that in our timeline, we see no more animations because the animations attached to camera 1 are now being hidden, or they're out of view, because the timeline is going to reflect our active camera that is selected. So in our animation wizard, let's say I want to do an inclination here. So I'll select that. I'll choose camera 2. And what we can do is we can scrub along to see what this is going to do. And in my opinion, maybe you don't want 45 degrees, let's say 30. And a couple things. Notice we didn't start at 0, so I'm going to go ahead and change this value to 0 for my starting point. And I only want this to last 2 seconds. And of course I can scrub along and I can see how that's going to look. And I'm going to ease in, ease out, and I will hit finish. And of course, let's say that we're looking at our animation right here, and I say, I want my drone to be in the center of the frame, and it's not. So you go ahead and what do? You take your camera and you pan it over. But a couple things that are interesting here is my camera is showing that it's not saved, of course, because I have to save and update it. But the other thing is I've also adjusted my camera in the middle of this animation. So we want to be sure that we're aware that we might be affecting the location of your subject in the framing for every frame, not just this first one, because you could make an adjustment to your camera at the very end and realize that once you've saved that, then in another frame, it's now in the wrong position. So that's something to be mindful of. So we've added one animation there. I'm going to add one more real quick. And in this case, we're going to let's just do a zoom out, choose camera 2. And of course, we have focal lengths to play with now. I'm going to start by taking the duration and matching the previous animation to 2 seconds. And I want my ease in, ease out, motion easing. And from focal length of 80 to 160. So we're starting at 80 and we're going to 160. Let's see what that looks like. So that means that we're actually zooming in quite far on our drone. And in my case, I actually want to zoom out. So I'm going to change this to a smaller value, try 40. So if we play that back, we can see that as we're tilting up, inclining, we're also pulling out, zooming out further. And I'll hit finish. And so now we have 2 cameras that each have 2 animations. So what if we want to switch from one to the next? I'll go ahead and make sure my camera is saved and I'll lock it. I'm going to go back to camera 1 and we see its animations here in the timeline. I'll drag my current time indicator, which is the little vertical bar, to the very end. And I'm going to go to my animation wizard and choose camera switch event. So at this point it says, which camera do you want to animate? I'll make sure I choose number 1 and then animate to camera 2. And the start time, we want this to always be after my first set of animations. So if the first sequence of animations took like 3 seconds, I want this to at least happen at the 3 second mark, probably something like 3.25, I'd say. And I'll hit finish. Now, here's where it may be confusing. You don't see any orange dot and you don't see a camera switch event added to your timeline yet. That's because you're going to see it on the 2 camera when it's active. So when I click on camera 2, all of a sudden we see our orange dot. That's where our camera is going to switch. So what I'm going to do now is take my animations I created for camera 2 and see how they're kind of out of order. I'm just going to reorganize them so they're next to each other. And I'll take both of them by shift selecting or clicking, and I'm going to drag them out to happen after my camera has switched from the previous camera. So now when I go ahead and play this back, and if I want nice smooth playback, we can switch to our geometry view. I'll put on a perspective camera. Actually, we'll keep it on active camera. So this will reflect what we're seeing a little bit more in our scene. When I play this back, we do and then we move out to the other camera. So you can see we have both of them. That first one is a little bit confusing, that first orbit and dolly. So if I turn one of those off, let's see what it looks like without the orbit. So we move away, switch, and then we tilt up and move out too. Very nice. And something else we can do, as previously mentioned, to help these out is we could add something like motion blur. I just want to let you guys know where that is. So by default, you have your little motion blur. When you click it, it becomes enabled and it turns blue. We can make sure that we turn it on for the camera and not for models or parts, because we're not animating any parts here. And then at this point, if you set your current time indicator to a certain frame, you should see that your model will blur a little bit depending on how quickly the camera is moving. If you have a high frames per second or a high fast frame rate, you're going to see much less of a motion blur effect as well, because it's essentially like a camera that's shooting at a high frame rate. And that is really the core of the animation tools, or at least the camera animation tools in KeyShot. And it looks like KeyShot decided to shut down on me, so I'm going to go ahead and open it up one more time. And that might be a perfect time to take some questions. I see we have about 10 minutes left, so if I left anything unanswered, or if you guys have any other burning questions, I'd be happy to answer those. I don't know if any of the other KeyShot employees on the line want to speak up. Not hearing anybody.
Right now, we really don't have many. We do have some questions about switch events. Let's see. Jesse's asking, if you don't want a position jump during a camera switch event, how do you ensure that camera 2 begins animating from the same position at which camera 1 ends?
Okay. I mean, here's the thing. I can still answer that question, but if you don't want that to happen, I'm just trying to think in the scenario of which that might be the case, because if it were me, I would just keep animating camera 1 if I don't want to switch to a second camera. Does that make sense? Generally, a camera switch event is used to jump to another position. That's its intended functionality. However, we have in our camera tab, let's say if I make a camera and I have position 1 here, we see this little button that has absolute values. When I click on this is going to show its position, direction up, kind of XYZ values. You could go ahead and try to match your camera values from the first and the second camera. And if I have, let's say I animate camera 1 here with just a translation, choose camera 1, and we'll take Y and we'll make this 200. And as I scrub along, we'll see that our camera will move up. Okay, I'll hit finish. And what we should see is that our camera right here, see if we add a new camera. Our second camera that we've added based on camera 1 is now starting where the previous one left off. So I could go ahead and then add a second animation here, and I could, say do a zoom, and I could leave those as is. Let's make this 1 second. Change this to 40. Finish. I'll save that. If I lock these two, if I go back, I have to create one more animation, which is my switch event. So I'll go ahead and click here. We'll do our camera switch. Choose camera 1, and we'll switch to camera 2. And we'll start it at 1 second. And if I go to camera 2, we should see our switch events right here. Let's make sure that my second animation happens after. I'm going to go ahead and move this camera switch event a little bit. So this here, if all goes well, should do exactly what was asked. So of course it's lagging a little bit in our real-time view, but that's how I would go about doing that, preserving the position from one camera to the next. So if you create a new camera after the previous camera is active, it should start in the location the previous one was at.
All right, thanks for that explanation, Will. That makes sense. John is asking if you were to do a fly-through in a room, would you suggest using dolly or transform?
Good question. Okay, so if I was to create a fly-through in an interior space, there's a number of ways we could do that. The answer, so the question was, would I use either a dolly or a translate? And the answer is yes to both. So in which case, if I have a third camera here that I want to start fresh, and I can go ahead and start by animating, and I can do a translation. And let's say I want to, here's another trick. If I click in the real-time view and I hit Z, we get our coordinates for the world. So I know which direction I want to move in now. So on camera 3, let's say I want to start by moving the camera in the x-axis. Try 500 or so. Let's try 1,000. And I also wanted it to move up a little bit. I'll try 500. Oops. And make it last 2 seconds, 3 seconds, so it goes pretty slow. So as I go ahead and play this, we're going to move. But then let's say I also wanted to rotate the camera to keep looking at the drone. We could do that. I could go ahead and choose another translation around the Y, or actually, I don't want to do it that way. Basically, where I'm going with this is you can essentially do and use as many of these animations simultaneously as you want. So you can go ahead and stack them and use them synchronously or simultaneously in order to achieve the right path that you wish. Correct. You can definitely use the path animation tool. It's got some limitations at this point, but if I go ahead and use it, you are given a little menu here where you can essentially choose where that camera is positioned. So if it's starting with my current location, and if I move my camera around and I hit add new, and add new, and add new, and hit OK. If I open my geometry view, oopsies, we can see the path that was created with that red line. So then if I were to play that back, we end up getting the camera moving along that path, but it can be at times a little bit challenging to consistently keep your subject in frame. So if I tend to only use that animation type if I am keeping, if I'm not doing any very extreme moves, basically translate, rotate, dolly, those are the ones I like to use.
Thanks, Will.
Of course.
Any other questions out there? Let's see, Ed is asking, can you make a transition between scenes such as a fade, or is this best done in some other program like After Effects?
So the answer is that it's best done if you want to do that in another editing program. However, that's if you're only using camera animations. So for instance, you can get really sneaky and tricky, and you know, if you animate, like we have such thing as a fade animation for a object. You know, like we can take our model and we could apply a fade animation to that, where we fade it out from 100% visible to 0% visible. So if I go ahead and scrub along here, you'll see that our model actually fades out to nothing. So if you did that in conjunction with switching to, say, from one view set to another, you could change your background and all that. But I think in the end, if you want full control over everything, you might want to do that in another program.
All right, great, thanks. That's a nice little trick. All right, I think that's about all the time we have. Anything else there, Will?
Not from my end. I mean, that's the thing. Camera animations, once you know the basics, and I think the number of questions we have today kind of reflects that. Once you know the basics, there's not a whole lot else to it as far as, you know, understanding it. It's very simple. We have the same basic animations we can use. It just comes down to how creative you can be, and using those in conjunction to create some nice and interesting animations. So something I did when I was practicing and looking at the coming up with ways to make a cool animation was look at trailers for films where there's lots of camera movement, like I don't know, I think I looked at like Cloverfield or something like that, where you've got this effect that someone has basically built a handheld cam effect, and you know, you don't need to use that much motion because it will honestly probably make some people sick, but you can take inspiration from that, and you can get creative and understand from actual films how they create nice dynamic visuals, and pick and pull parts that will work well for the presentation you're trying to create. So that's my biggest recommendation there, and have fun with it, of course.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we look forward to seeing your animations. Share them on the KeyShot forum. And just a reminder, if you haven't heard about KeyShot Render World yet, check it out at keyshot.com/renderworld. We would love to see you out in California in May, and where you'll be able to see speakers from Bose and Stanley Black & Decker. We've got a lot of great speakers, workshops from Will and Richard and the crew. So check it out, get your tickets. They're going fast, and there's not much space left. So thanks again, everyone, for attending the webinar. It'll be up on YouTube very soon, and we will see you next time.
All right. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, everyone who attended, as he mentioned. If you want to see more, it's going to be on youtube.com/KeyShot3D. And you can also go to keyshot.com/learning for more videos, tips, and tutorials. And until next time, happy rendering.